The shocking truth staring everyone in the face right now is that millions of women are sliding into extreme poverty while the very men they spent years pushing away have finally walked out the door for good and found real peace in their own lives. Listen up, because this is not some temporary rough patch or a phase that will blow over when the economy turns around. Women who spent decades telling men they were toxic, unnecessary, and replaceable are now posting videos every single day crying about how they cannot afford rent or put food on the table, and suddenly they are calling out for men to step back in and fix everything. The same voices that shouted men should go away are now begging for help, but the hard reality is that those men are not coming back because they have discovered something better than the constant drama and disrespect they endured for years. Think about that for a minute, because it cuts straight to the core of what is happening in society today. And if you stick with me through this entire conversation, you will see exactly why this shift is permanent, why it is accelerating, and why the consequences for everyone, especially women who built their lives around certain assumptions, are going to be far more severe than most people are willing to admit right now. We are not talking about hurt feelings or minor inconveniences here. We are looking at a complete breakdown in the social contract that held things together for generations. And once that contract is gone, there is no easy way to put it back together. Men have reached their limit after years of being treated as disposable villains in every story women told themselves in society. They put up with the berating, the physical aggression, the constant lying and exaggerating about encounters, the false accusations, and the endless narrative that painted them as pathetic obstacles to female empowerment. For decades, men held back their natural responses because they believed in the rules of civilized society. And they trusted that the system would protect them if things went too far. That trust is gone now. And what is replacing it is a quiet but unstoppable decision to simply walk away from dating, from marriage, from traditional workplaces, from public spaces, and from any situation where they are expected to play the role of provider, protector, or emotional punching bag. They have found solitude, and in that solitude, they have discovered peace, something many of them never knew existed because they were too busy trying to meet impossible standards set by a culture that demonized them for simply existing as men. This is not anger talking, although there is plenty of justified anger built up over the years. This is cold, clear pattern recognition. Men looked at the data of their own lives and the lives of their friends, brothers, and coworkers, and they saw the same story repeated over and over. Women embraced ideas from 50 years of feminism that promised them total independence and power over their own destinies, while simultaneously demanding that men remain in traditional roles of provision and protection, but only when it suited them. The result was a one sided deal where men gave everything and received disrespect, mockery, and legal vulnerability in return. Now the bill is coming due, and women are starting to feel the weight of a world where men are no longer willing to carry it for them. Hard economic times are already here, and 2026 is shaping up to be the year when everything that has been papered over with debt and denial finally cracks wide open. Everyone with eyes open can see the signs of an economic meltdown brewing, with collapsing markets, rising costs of living, and institutions that are running out of ways to prop up the illusions. What makes this moment different is that the economic pressure is landing on top of decades of repressed male anger that has been building like pressure in a sealed container. Men have been told to be quiet, to be docile, to accept abuse as the price of being allowed to participate in society. They watched as women used the state and a network of enablers to shield themselves from any real accountability while simultaneously claiming victim status at every turn. That dynamic worked as long as the economy was strong enough to keep the privileges flowing, and as long as enough men were willing to play along out of fear or habit. But now, the state itself is broke, society is fracturing, and the special protections women counted on are starting to evaporate because they have simply become too expensive to maintain. Women do not hold real power on their own. What they had were privileges granted in exchange for supporting certain agendas. And now that the money is drying up, those privileges are fading fast. Picture it like the classic story of the boy who cried wolf, except in this version, the criers did not just raise false alarms. They spent 50 years actively tormenting the very people they later expected to rescue them. They hit men physically and emotionally, then hid behind laws that assumed men were always at fault. They made false claims that ruined lives and careers, then acted shocked when men started documenting everything and refusing to engage. They proclaimed themselves powerful victims while treating men as disposable villains, and they did it all with the confidence that the system would always back them up. That confidence is cracking because the system is running out of resources and men are running out of patience. The era of claiming victimhood while acting with clear villainy is ending, and men are starting to treat people exactly as their actions deserve rather than as the narrative demands. This is where things get sobering because when the last layers of protection fall away, the pent up response from men is not going to be gentle or forgiving. Women always operated on the assumption that they could push and slap and accuse, and men would never push back in any meaningful way. They believed their words alone carried enough weight to control outcomes and that society would enforce it. But words lose their power when the enforcement mechanism breaks down, and that is exactly what is happening now. Simps who once rushed to defend every claim, no matter how outrageous, are proving to be cowards when real stakes appear. The state that once acted as a reliable shield is facing its own collapse and cannot afford to keep paying for the imbalances it created. When that happens, the dynamic flips and decades of stored resentment do not disappear. They find expression in ways that no amount of social media posting or public crying will be able to soften. Men are no longer viewing women through any hopeful lens that assumes basic goodness or reciprocity. Pattern recognition has taken over, and the pattern is clear. Too many women demonstrated through consistent behavior that they were willing to exploit, and then blame when the exploitation stopped working. This is not every single woman, but the numbers are high enough and the examples loud enough that men are making rational decisions based on probability rather than exceptions. They see the entitlement, the lack of accountability, the constant moving of goalposts, and they choose solitude instead. Solitude gives them control over their time, their money, and their mental health. It gives them the chance to build something real without the risk of it being torn down by someone who never learned to value what they bring to the table. Look at what is unfolding in places like China, where the same trends are playing out on an even larger scale. Men there are refusing to marry because the financial burdens have become insane, with demands for houses, cars, and massive bride prices on top of raising children in an economy that barely supports basic living. Women who delayed marriage chasing careers or higher status are now in their 30s and 40s, realizing the pool of willing men has dried up and they are left with regrets that no amount of education or independence can fix. They are lowering standards frantically, but the men who once would have accepted those terms have already checked out and chosen freedom over the gamble of a system stacked against them. The same story is repeating here and in every developed nation where feminism reshaped expectations without reshaping responsibilities in a balanced way. Back home, the loneliness epidemic among women is not some mysterious force. It is the direct result of choices made over years where independence was celebrated as the ultimate goal, while connection and mutual respect were treated as optional or even oppressive. Women in their 40s are posting about how dating feels impossible, how men do not approach anymore, and how they feel low, invisible, or like a burden. The truth is, men stopped approaching because the risk became too high and the rewards too low. false accusations, harassment claims, and a culture that treats every interaction as potentially predatory made even polite conversation feel like walking through a minefield. Add in the economic survival mode most average men are in, where every extra dollar an hour goes toward keeping a roof over their own heads, and there is simply no bandwidth left for chasing someone who may turn around and treat them as disposable anyway. This withdrawal is not bitterness, it is self preservation, and it is spreading because more and more men are seeing their friends, brothers, and coworkers thrive in quiet solitude. They work on their own goals, hit the gym, save money, travel light, and enjoy real peace without the drama of constant testing and criticism. Women, on the other hand, are discovering that independence solves certain practical problems, but leaves emotional voids that no career or social media validation can fill. The quiet apartment at night, the weekends with no plans, the realization that no one is obligated to be there when things get hard. Those realities hit harder as the years pile on, and biology does not negotiate with slogans about empowerment. Fertility windows close, options narrow, and the market value that felt infinite in the 20s suddenly follows supply and demand like everything else. The economic crash that is building will accelerate all of this because when resources get scarce, the illusions collapse fastest. Record debt levels collapsing, savings, rising delinquencies on loans and credit cards, commercial real estate failures, and central banks losing control of the narrative. These are not abstract problems. They mean families breaking under pressure, small businesses closing, jobs disappearing, and governments unable to keep printing their way out of trouble. In that environment, men who have already walked away are positioned to protect what little they have left, while women who built lives expecting endless provision and protection find themselves exposed. The state cannot bail everyone out, and the simps who once formed a buffer are facing their own struggles and proving unreliable when push comes to shove. What is coming is a return to raw reality where strength, physical capability, and self reliance matter again. Men on average carry 40% more strength, denser bones, faster reflexes, and evolutionary wiring that prepared them for protection and provision under pressure. They held that strength in check for the sake of civilization. But civilization is fraying and restraint has limits. Every man knows he could physically dominate almost any woman in seconds, yet most chose not to because they valued order and fairness. When that choice is no longer respected, and when the systems enforcing it fail, the consequences can shift quickly and without warning. This is not a call for violence. It is a statement of biological and historical fact that ignoring reality does not make it disappear. Women walked a dangerous path by mistaking male restraint for weakness and by pushing boundaries, assuming there would never be a breaking point. They humiliated men for social media likes, rated them publicly, mocked their efforts, and then expected those same men to keep providing when times got tough. Disrespect erodes everything long before open conflict appears, and relationships die in that erosion. Now, men are opting out, entirely selling houses, moving to cabins, or simply staying home because the juice is no longer worth the squeeze. Infrastructure is already straining as men leave certain trades, military recruitment is collapsing, marriage rates are plummeting, and birth rates are below replacement levels. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of a system that treated half the population as defective, and now that half is refusing to participate on those terms. The black pill perspective is growing among men because pattern recognition leaves little room for hope when the patterns are this consistent. Women are not seen as inherently evil by every man, but enough have shown through repeated behavior that trust is a luxury few can afford anymore. Victim claims ring hollow when the actions tell a different story of entitlement and blame shifting. Kevin Samuels used to warn that winter was coming, and that hard times would expose the gaps between rhetoric and reality. Those times are arriving faster than most expected, and they will not be gentle. Feminism won many battles over 50 years, but it is on track to lose the war in a way that sets women back generations in terms of real freedom, autonomy, and well being. Legal protections, social privileges, and economic advantages built on shaky foundations are crumbling, and when they fall, the regression could be brutal, returning women to standards of living and limited options that their grandmothers would recognize all too well. Men are using the word no more than ever, and 2026 will amplify that refusal across every area of life. No to unfair burdens, no to one sided expectations, no to being treated as walking ATMs or emotional support animals. No to participating in a society that demonizes them while demanding their labor and protection. This is not spite, it is clarity after years of fog. Hard economic times will test everyone but men who have already simplified their lives and detached from toxic dynamics will weather the storm with far less damage. Women who counted on the old script will face the full weight of consequences they helped create through decades of pushing without regard for balance or reciprocity. The can of worms opened here is massive because human nature does not change just because laws or slogans say it should. Biology, economics, and basic psychology are reasserting themselves after a long period of denial. Men are finding peace in solitude, and they are not looking back because the alternative proved too costly in every sense. Women crying on social media about survival are the visible tip of a much larger shift where the assumptions of the last 50 years are being dismantled, one quiet withdrawal at a time. This is the sobering reality, and it is only beginning to unfold. The economic pressures, the social fractures, and the accumulated resentment are converging into something that will reshape how men and women relate to each other and to society itself for decades to come. Those who face it with clear eyes will navigate it better than those who cling to old illusions. The psychological toll on men was real, even if it was rarely discussed openly. Constant criticism for natural traits like stoicism or problem solving without endless emotional processing wore them down. They were told their strength was toxic, their logic was mansplaining, and their desire for peace was avoidance. Over time, many stopped trying to explain themselves and simply removed themselves from the equation. Solitude became the ultimate boundary, a place where no one could demand they fix problems they did not create or carry loads they did not sign up for. In that space, men rediscovered hobbies, built skills, saved money, and experienced mental clarity that relationships filled with testing and drama had stolen from them. This was not running away. It was strategic disengagement from a game whose rules changed constantly to favor one side. Economic data backs up the shift in ways that are impossible to ignore. Housing affordability has hit lows not seen in decades, with rents and mortgages consuming larger portions of income while wages stagnate for average workers. Credit card debt is at record highs as people borrow to cover basics like food and fuel. Small businesses are closing at accelerating rates, and commercial real estate, especially. Office space is losing value as remote work and caution keep people home. Governments borrow at unsustainable levels. Central banks face impossible choices between inflation and recession, and yield curve inversions have preceded every major downturn for the past half century. Insiders sell stocks at record pace, while public narratives push stories of soft landings and recovery. The illusion is maintained until it cannot be. And when it breaks, the transfer of wealth and stability will favor those who prepared by simplifying and detaching rather than those who doubled down on dependency. In this environment, the loneliness women report is not abstract. It is the gap between the independence they were sold and the human need for reliable connection that no amount of self care routines or friend groups can fully replace. Women in their 30s and 40s describe weekends spent alone or with pets, realizing that the strong, independent script left them carrying all responsibilities without the partnership they once took for granted. Men their age are choosing younger partners or no partners at all because the baggage of past choices and the expectation of provision without reciprocity make older, independent women less appealing in the dating market. Supply and demand are brutal teachers. Youth vitality and flexibility command higher value, while accumulated demands and reduced options lead to frustration and lowered standards that still go unmet because the men worth having have already opted out. The risk calculation for men is straightforward. Marriage carries high odds of asset division, child custody battles, and ongoing financial obligations, even when the relationship ends through no fault of their own. False accusations in domestic situations often lead to immediate arrest and lengthy legal processes that favor the accuser regardless of evidence. Workplace interactions are documented meticulously because a single misinterpreted comment can end a career. Public approaches carry the danger of being labeled predatory even when intentions are respectful. When every interaction carries downside risk and limited upside, many men decide the rational choice is to abstain entirely. They focus on self improvement, career stability, and personal peace because those areas still reward effort directly without the interference of shifting expectations or legal vulnerabilities. This disengagement shows up in falling marriage rates, declining birth rates, and reduced participation in traditional social venues. Men are not at clubs or bars chasing validation because they have learned that peace at home beats the exhaustion of repeated courtship cycles that often end in ghosting or conflict. Relationships that last only 1 to 3 years require starting over with new people, investing time, money, and energy only to face the same patterns again. Many conclude the juice is not worth the squeeze and redirect that energy into skills, hobbies, and financial security. Women notice the absence and express confusion or anger, but the feedback loop of entitlement and lack of reciprocity created the conditions for the withdrawal in the first place. When men are treated as walking wallets or emotional regulators rather than partners, the incentive to engage disappears. The broader societal impact is already visible in infrastructure strains, military recruitment shortfalls, and innovation slowdowns as men who once filled critical roles step back or redirect their efforts to personal projects. Society functioned because enough men were willing to build, maintain, and protect it despite the personal costs. When those costs become too high and the rewards too uncertain, the foundation weakens. This is not punishment. It is consequence following from years of devaluing the contributions and character of men while elevating narratives that frame them as obstacles. The correction is painful but necessary if any balance is to return. Women who once believed they could hit men without response or make accusations without evidence are learning that nothing is permanent, especially when the supporting structures erode. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. The state that once enforced imbalances is facing bankruptcy and public backlash. Enablers who rush to defend every claim are dealing with their own economic pressures and withdrawing support. Without that buffer, the raw dynamics of accountability reemerge, and decades of stored resentment do not vanish quietly. Men are not seeking confrontation, but they are no longer willing to absorb endless provocation under the guise of progress. Restraint was a choice rooted in civilization, and when civilization frays, the choice can shift. The coming years will test these realities in ways that no amount of social media coping can obscure. Economic meltdown will strip away the padding that allowed imbalances to persist. Scarcity will force choices based on actual capability rather than slogans. Men who embrace solitude will have the mental and financial reserves to adapt, while those who remained entangled in toxic dynamics will face harder adjustments. The wake up call is straightforward. Assumptions built on 50 years of one sided social engineering are colliding with biological, economic, and psychological truths that were never erased, only ignored. The men who walked away did so because they saw the pattern clearly and chose peace over participation in a losing game. That choice is spreading, and the consequences for the old order are only beginning to unfold. The economic signals flashing red right now paint a picture that no one can afford to ignore because the debt levels piled up across governments, corporations, and households have turned into a slow motion avalanche that will bury the old assumptions about endless growth and easy provision. Credit card balances sit at historic highs while savings rates have evaporated for the average person, forcing families to juggle multiple jobs just to cover rent, groceries, and fuel that keep climbing faster than wages. Commercial real estate, especially office towers, stands half empty with values dropping to fractions of what they once commanded because remote work and caution have kept people away. And banks holding those loans face exposure that could ripple through the entire system when defaults hit in waves. Yield curves have inverted across the board, a reliable warning sign that has preceded every major recession for more than 50 years. And insiders are selling stocks at a pace rarely seen before, while public narratives still push stories of soft landings and recovery. This disconnect between market highs and real economy pain is not accidental. It is the final stage of an illusion built on borrowed money that can no longer be sustained without triggering either runaway inflation or a deep contraction that breaks the current order. Men who already walked away from the old relationship script are better positioned in this environment because they simplified their lives, reduced dependencies, and built personal reserves instead of tying their futures to volatile partnerships or one sided expectations. They watch the patterns of constant financial pressure in marriages where expenses for housing, cars, and lifestyle demands escalated without corresponding commitment or reciprocity, and they chose to keep control of their own resources. In places like China, the marriage market has collapsed under similar weights with bride prices and demands for houses and cars, turning what should be a partnership into a transactional burden that ordinary men cannot carry without going deep into debt for decades. Marriage registrations there plunged to record lows in recent years, dropping over 20% in a single year as men quietly opted out, realizing the risks of asset loss in divorce child custody battles and ongoing payments outweighed any promised benefits. Women in their 30s and 40s now express regret over delayed choices and high standards that left them facing singlehood in an imbalanced market where successful men prefer freedom over materialistic competition. And the cycle only deepens as more men withdraw further. This withdrawal is not limited to one country. It reflects a global rebalancing where men recognize that biological differences in strength, capability, and risk tolerance were never erased by laws or slogans. On average, men carry about 40% more upper body strength, denser bones, and faster reflexes wired from evolutionary history for protection and provision under pressure. Yet they exercised restraint daily in civilized settings because they valued order and fairness. That restraint was taken for granted or even mocked as weakness, while women tested boundaries through physical aggression, verbal humiliation, or public ratings that eroded trust over time. A man might walk away from a thrown dish or a public 6 out of 10 rating to avoid legal traps, but each incident deposits resentment that accumulates until the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving entirely. Engineers sell houses and move to remote cabins, and tradesmen leave demanding fields, and young men skip dating apps altogether because the documented risk of false claims, career damage, or emotional drain make solitude the clearer path to stability. The legal and social frameworks that once shielded provocative behavior are fraying as budgets tighten and public tolerance for imbalances wears thin. Policies built on models that assumed men were default aggressors led to immediate arrests in domestic disputes, even when evidence later showed otherwise, creating incentives for manipulation that men eventually learned to avoid by disengaging completely. Women initiated domestic violence at rates equal to or higher than men in many studies. Yet media and policy focused overwhelmingly on one direction, leaving men with little recourse except documentation and distance. When bystanders in public arguments side automatically with the woman, regardless of who started the push or slap, it reinforces the pattern that words and claims carry weight while male restraint is expected without appreciation. Over years, this dynamic trained men to see relationships as high risk ventures where respect is optional and consequences are one sided. So they redirected energy into gyms, personal projects, and financial independence where effort produces direct returns without interference. Birth rates have fallen below replacement levels across developed nations, with projections showing continued decline as fewer people form stable families and women delay or forego children while chasing independence that leaves emotional and practical gaps later. In the United States, fewer than half of households are now married couple homes, down from nearly two-thirds 50 years ago. And the median age at first marriage has climbed to over 30 for men and 28 for women, meaning many enter the market with established habits and expectations that clash with reality. Labor force participation tells part of the story, with women holding steady around 57%, while male participation has trended lower over decades as some opt for self employment or reduced hours to maintain control. Prime age women have driven recent job gains, particularly in health and social assistance, but overall, economic pressures hit harder for those without shared burdens or backup when costs spike or jobs shift. The infrastructure strains are already visible as men exit traditional trades, military service, and certain public roles that once relied on their willingness to endure physical demands and risk for societal benefit. Recruitment shortfalls in fields requiring strength and resilience signal that the quiet protest of walking away affects more than personal lives. It undermines the foundation that supported the very privileges some took for granted. Boys in school face pathologizing of natural energy and competitiveness labeled as problems rather than traits to channel productively, leading to confusion and later resentment when they enter adulthood facing the same double standards. This generational effect compounds because without balanced modeling of mutual respect, the cycle of disengagement accelerates as young men observe older ones thriving in simplicity and choose the same path over repeating known failures. Hard times expose the gaps between rhetoric and capability because when resources tighten, people fall back on raw realities rather than negotiated narratives. Men, on average, handle solitude with less distress because their wiring prioritizes problem solving and independence, while many women report rising loneliness as the independent script collides with the human need for a reliable partnership that no amount of career achievement or social media connection fully replaces. Videos of women in their later years describing quiet apartments, empty weekends, and fears of nursing home isolation without family support reveal the long term cost of choices that prioritized short term autonomy over building interdependent bonds. Lowering standards after years of selectivity often comes too late because the men who once met those criteria have already built lives without the drama and now seek peace or partners without accumulated baggage. The black pill lens that more men adopt comes from consistent pattern recognition across cultures and decades where entitlement shifted blame and lack of reciprocity created predictable outcomes. Women claimed power through independence, yet relied on male provision when convenient and state enforcement when challenged, creating a hybrid expectation that no sustainable system can maintain indefinitely. In China, the excess of men in some demographics combined with material demands has left matchmaking events filled with female profiles, while men opt for single life or foreign options rather than debt servitude. Testimonials from educated women in their mid 30s describe panic over lost fertility windows and difficulty finding partners who accept reduced expectations because the market has adjusted to the withdrawal, and high value men hold firm boundaries. Economic forecasts point to continued challenges with labor force growth, slowing due to aging populations and native born cohorts, shrinking meaning immigration and policy shifts will dominate discussions, but cannot fully offset the disengagement rooted in deeper social fractures. Fertility rates hovering around 1.5 or lower signal long term population pressures that will strain pension systems, healthcare, and economic output as fewer workers support more retirees. Governments face impossible choices between raising rates that would crush debt laden entities or cutting them that reignite inflation, leaving central banks trapped in a cycle where trust in institutions erodes further. When currency confidence fades and prices fluctuate unpredictably, the advantage goes to those who minimize dependencies and maximize personal control, which describes the men who embrace solitude after experiencing the alternative. This convergence of economic meltdown and accumulated resentment creates conditions where old protections lose effectiveness because the state cannot sustain endless subsidies or enforcement when revenues fall and debts mount. Simps who once formed a vocal buffer often prove unreliable under real pressure, turning to self preservation when their own resources are threatened. Women who built lives assuming perpetual male compliance or institutional backup now face the full weight of decisions made without regard for balance. And the sobering part is that consequences do not negotiate with past narratives. The story of pushing boundaries while mistaking restraint for permanent weakness reaches its logical end when the systems enforcing one sided rules run out of capacity, and men who have practiced disengagement simply continue on their chosen path. Men are not seeking open conflict, they are exercising the ultimate boundary by removing themselves from situations that repeatedly demonstrated disrespect and risk without reward. This choice preserves their mental health, financial security, and freedom in ways that entangled dynamics rarely did. They hit the gym, build skills, save aggressively, and enjoy clear headed days without constant testing or criticism that drained energy from more productive pursuits. In contrast, the loneliness epidemic among women stems directly from the gap between sold ideals of empowerment and the practical need for mutual support that biology and psychology never stopped requiring. When weekends stretch empty and responsibilities stack without a reliable partner, the independence that felt liberating in youth reveals its limits, especially as health or financial shocks arrive without backup. And the broader societal rewrite underway will favor those who adapted early by simplifying and detaching from toxic expectations. Infrastructure projects slow when labor in critical trades dries up innovation paces, change when risk averse cultures dominate, and family formation declines further when men calculate the odds and walk away. These are not punishments, but natural outcomes of treating half the population as defective while demanding their full contribution on unfair terms. The correction feels harsh because denial lasted so long, but facing reality allows clearer navigation through the hard times ahead. Continuing this narrative, the patterns of male restraint as the invisible glue of civilization deserve deeper examination because for generations, men suppressed natural advantages in strength and aggression to uphold social order, trusting that reciprocity and fairness would hold. In everyday interactions, they absorbed provocations, walked away from escalating arguments, and redirected fury into constructive outlets like physical training or work because the alternative risked legal, social, or personal destruction. A single misinterpreted action could trigger accusations that favored the claimant under prevailing models, leading men to document conversations, avoid private settings, and ultimately limit engagement to bare minimum. Over decades, this self censorship accumulated into widespread fatigue, where the effort to remain civilized yielded diminishing returns in respect or stability. Examples from daily life illustrate the shift without drama. A man in a coffee shop argument might restrain a wrist after being pushed only to see bystanders intervene on her behalf while she smirks, knowing the narrative protects her. Another discovers a public rating or humiliation video that mocks his efforts and chooses silent departure rather than confrontation that could end in charges. These incidents seem small in isolation, but repeated across millions of lives. They erode the willingness to invest in relationships or public participation. Engineers who once thrived in high pressure roles sell assets and retreat to cabins where no one demands they fix unfixable emotional loads or carry disproportionate financial weights. Tradesmen exit fields plagued by constant vulnerability because false claims travel faster than evidence and careers end before facts emerge. In China, the scale is even more pronounced, with rural men facing bride prices averaging tens of thousands of yuan, often requiring loans that take years to repay, while women demand houses, cars, and luxury signals as proof of commitment. Successful men with six figure incomes and assets still choose solitude, citing materialistic competition, where partners compare gifts and status rather than building genuine bonds. Women in their mid 30s with advanced degrees describe following independence advice only to face sleepless nights, regretting missed windows for family formation, and struggling in blind date markets where lowered standards still go unmet because available men have opted out. The vicious cycle deepens as female anxiety grows and male withdrawal accelerates, leaving matchmaking parks and agencies imbalanced and society facing sharper demographic declines. Economic data reinforces the personal choices because housing affordability sits at generational lows, with rents and mortgages consuming larger shares of income while wages for average workers stagnate. Delinquencies on auto loans, credit cards, and mortgages rise in patterns echoing pre crisis periods, yet official narratives downplay the risks. Small businesses close at accelerating rates as costs for labor, energy, and compliance mount, leaving fewer opportunities for steady provision that once anchored family life. When commercial real estate values collapse, banks tighten, lending further squeezing the middle that once buffered extremes, and the illusion of perpetual prosperity fades for those still tied to the old script. Men embracing black pill clarity do so through observation, not ideology, noting consistent behaviors across contexts where victim claims coincide with actions lacking accountability. They see entitlement in demands for provision without equivalent contribution risks in legal systems weighted toward one side and emotional labor expected without reciprocity. This leads to rational risk assessment, where the probability of positive outcomes drops below the threshold for engagement, and solitude becomes the default setting that delivers control and peace. Younger men absorb these lessons early through stories from friends and online patterns, choosing skill building over chasing validation in markets stacked against them. The fertility and marriage data tell the long term tale, with rates continuing downward as women prioritize career milestones that delay family formation, and men calculate the lifetime costs of potential divorce, asset division, and child support against the freedom of self directed lives. In the United States, one person households now account for nearly 30% of all homes, up significantly from decades past, reflecting both choice and consequence of delayed or avoided partnerships. Labor participation gaps narrow in some metrics, but overall, workforce dynamics shift as aging reduces native growth and disengagement removes willing participants from traditional roles. This sobering landscape demands acknowledgement that human nature reasserts itself when artificial constructs weaken. Biology favors certain capabilities in men for heavy labor protection and provision, just as it equips women for other strengths, yet denying differences in the name of equality, created imbalances that cannot hold under pressure. When economic scarcity returns, strength, self reliance, and low dependency become advantages, not toxicities, and those who prepared through solitude will navigate the transition with fewer fractures. The men who walked away did not do so lightly, but after patterns left no other rational path, and their continued absence signals that restoration requires genuine reciprocity rather than renewed demands. The coming period of adjustment will test assumptions harshly because scarcity does not allow for endless negotiation or subsidized illusions. Governments facing revenue shortfalls cannot maintain expansive safety nets or enforcement mechanisms at prior levels, leaving individuals to rely more on personal networks and capabilities. Men who built those capabilities in quiet independence hold an edge, while those entangled in unresolved dynamics face harder reckonings. The wake up call here is straightforward. The decades of one sided social engineering produced predictable withdrawals, and the economic forces now amplifying them will reshape interactions in ways that favor realism over rhetoric. Women facing these shifts often describe the practical burdens of full independence when health issues arise. Job losses, hit, or aging brings isolation without family buffers. The independence sold as ultimate freedom solves certain barriers, but leaves voids in companionship support and shared purpose that careers or friend circles rarely fill completely. Lowering standards in later years reflects awareness of changed market realities, yet the men who once filled those roles have adapted to lives without the prior pressures, and many maintain firm boundaries against repeating past cycles. This is not cruelty, it is consequence flowing from choices that devalued male contributions while elevating expectations without matching responsibilities. The infrastructure of society built on male willingness to endure and provide now shows cracks where participation wanes. Military and trade shortages affect readiness and maintenance, while innovation slows if risk taking cultures diminish. These effects compound over time, creating feedback loops where fewer stable families mean lower birth rates and greater strain on systems designed for growing populations. Addressing it requires facing the patterns honestly rather than doubling down on narratives that accelerated the disengagement in the first place. Men continue using the word no across domains, refusing unfair burdens, one sided emotional labor, and participation in setups that treat them as disposable. This refusal is clarity born from experience, where years of compliance yielded disrespect and vulnerability. In 2026 and beyond, this stance will define more lives as economic pressures force sharper decisions, and solitude proves its value in preserving sanity and resources. The peace found there is not isolation for its own sake, but a boundary that protects against dynamics proven unreliable. The larger story unfolding is one of rebalancing, where ignored truths about capability, accountability, and reciprocity reemerge stronger after denial. Feminism secured many surface changes, but the deeper war for sustainable relations tilts as men vote with their feet and time reveals the costs of imbalance. Women who understand this shift early can adjust toward mutual respect, but the window narrows as more men settle into lives that no longer revolve around fixing problems they did not create. Hard economic times will accelerate the sorting because survival favors those who detached from fragility and built inner strength. This narrative builds on observable patterns without romanticizing any side because truth demands directness. Men walked away after enduring berating false claims and demonization for existing as men, and they found peace in the process. Women now confronting poverty and loneliness in growing numbers see the results of assumptions that independence required no trade offs. The convergence with economic collapse creates a moment where illusions end and reality resets expectations for everyone involved. Those who face it with clear eyes will fare better than those clinging to fading privileges. The debt situation hanging over economies worldwide has reached levels that make past crises look manageable because public debt in major nations has climbed toward or beyond 100% of gross domestic product, with projections pushing even higher if spending patterns continue unchanged. Interest payments alone now consume massive portions of tax revenues, and those costs will only grow as rates stay elevated or climb further amid uncertainty. In the United States, forecasts from major banks place recession odds for the coming period anywhere from 30 to nearly 50%, depending on oil prices, geopolitical tensions, and consumer exhaustion after years of high inflation and record household debt topping $18 trillion. Families juggle multiple incomes, yet still face squeezed budgets as rents, mortgages, groceries, and fuel eat larger shares of earnings while savings rates hover near zero for average people. Commercial real estate, especially office buildings, sits under heavy pressure, with vacancies driving values down and exposing banks to losses that could spread if defaults accelerate. These pressures do not exist in isolation. They compound the social withdrawal already underway, as men who simplified their lives avoid the added volatility of entangled finances that once defined traditional setups. In China, the marriage numbers tell a stark story of the same forces at work, with registrations dropping to record lows around 6.1 million. In recent years, a plunge of over 20% in a single year and far below peaks from a decade earlier. First marriages fell sharply as young men calculated the costs of bride prices, houses, cars, and ongoing expectations against uncertain economic outlooks, and chose to stay single rather than enter debt that could last decades. Even modest rebounds in some quarters reflect procedural changes or pent up timing rather than a true reversal, because deeper attitudes have shifted, with men prioritizing freedom over material competition and women facing narrowed options after delaying family formation for careers or higher standards. The demographic headwinds intensify as birth rates continue declining, with fewer stable partnerships forming, to begin with, leaving projections of shrinking populations and strained support systems for aging citizens. This pattern mirrors what is happening elsewhere, where economic uncertainty combines with changed expectations to reduce the incentive for long term commitments that carry heavy downsides for one side. Male labor force participation has trended lower for decades, with prime age men showing gaps explained by factors like skills mismatch, prolonged education, disability caregiving, and simply opting for arrangements that offer more control over time and effort. Millions of working age men sit outside the traditional workforce, not because opportunities vanished entirely, but because the rewards in many roles no longer justify the risks or the lifestyle trade offs, especially when compared to self directed paths that avoid constant scrutiny or unfair burdens. Industries that once relied on male labor for physical demanding or high risk work face shortages as men redirect energy toward personal stability rather than roles where contributions feel undervalued or exposed to one sided accountability. This shift affects broader infrastructure readiness, innovation pace, and economic output because societies built on that participation now adjust to slower growth in those areas without the same willingness to endure for collective benefit. Fertility rates across developed nations sit well below replacement levels, often around 1.4 to 1.6 children per woman, with some regions dipping even lower as economic costs of parenthood, housing insecurity, job instability, and concerns about the future weigh on decisions. People still express desire for children, but barriers like high living expenses, lack of suitable partners, and shifting priorities delay or prevent family formation, leading to more one person households and rising reports of loneliness, especially in later years. Childlessness rates climb, with projections suggesting up to 30% of certain cohorts may remain without kids. And this correlates with higher loneliness scores in older age because family buffers that once provided support and connection become absent. The independence that was promoted as liberation solves some immediate constraints, but leaves practical and emotional gaps when shocks arrive or routines grow quiet without shared responsibilities or companionship that feels reliable. Kevin Samuels captured the essence when he warned that winter was coming for those who built expectations around one sided dynamics without preparing for accountability or changed conditions. He pointed out how rhetoric about empowerment often ignored the realities of market value reciprocity and the long term consequences of treating relationships as transactions, where one party held leverage through social or legal advantages. That warning resonates now as hard times strip away the padding and force clearer assessments of what sustains partnerships versus what erodes them. Women who once assumed endless provision or protection without matching investment face the practical outcomes of those assumptions when resources tighten and men maintain boundaries that protect their own peace. The patterns of berating physical aggression, false claims, and public demonization for basic male traits accumulated resentment that found expression not in explosion, but in quiet, permanent disengagement, where solitude delivers mental clarity and financial control that drama filled interactions rarely did. The boy who cried wolf analogy fits because repeated false alarms or exaggerated claims about threats and victimhood eventually erode credibility to the point where genuine needs go unmet when systems or goodwill run dry. In this case, the claims were not just alarms, they involved active reshaping of norms that punished men for existing while shielding provocative behavior behind institutional protections that now strain under their own weight. When budgets tighten and public tolerance for imbalances fades, the buffer disappears and actions face direct consequences rather than deflected blame. Men who documented patterns over years reached the same conclusion through observation that trust requires evidence of reciprocity, not assumptions of perpetual compliance. They chose paths where their effort produces tangible results without the interference of shifting rules or emotional labor that went unappreciated. This disengagement shows up in everyday choices where men avoid public venues that once served as social hubs, skip approaches that carry documented risks, and focus instead on gyms, skill development, and savings that build personal resilience. They see friends thrive in simplified routines with clear boundaries and lower stress levels, compared to cycles of testing criticism and potential legal vulnerability that drained energy without building lasting value. Younger generations absorb these lessons early through shared stories and observable outcomes, choosing education, trades, or self employment that allow control rather than repeating setups where contributions feel disposable. The result is a slower but steady restructuring of how resources, time, and energy flow in society, favoring those who minimize dependencies early. Economic forecasts for the age period ahead point to mediocre growth at best, with risks of stagflation, light from policy pressures, tariffs, consumer fatigue, and potential asset bubbles in areas like technology that propped up sentiment. Unemployment ticks higher in some projections, while inflation remains sticky, forcing central banks into difficult balancing acts that cannot satisfy all demands. Governments face rising interest burdens that crowd out other spending, leaving less room for the subsidies or enforcement mechanisms that once maintained certain social equilibria. When fiscal credibility comes under question, bond markets react with higher yields, tightening conditions further and amplifying the squeeze on households already stretched thin. In that environment, the advantage shifts to individuals who reduced obligations and built buffers rather than those who counted on continued external support or one sided deals. Loneliness data reveals the human cost on the other side, with surveys showing higher rates among younger adults, especially those navigating single life or delayed milestones in high cost environments. Nearly half of some under 30 groups report being single, with additional portions in distant relationships that lack daily integration. Abstinence or reduced intimacy becomes more common across certain demographics as polarization grows and interactions carry perceived risks or mismatched expectations. Older cohorts face amplified isolation when childlessness combines with aging without family networks that traditionally provided connection and practical help. The voids left by prioritizing career or autonomy over interdependent bonds become harder to fill with routines or virtual substitutes, especially as health or financial pressures mount without backup. The black pill perspective strengthens among men because repeated patterns across cultures show entitlement blame shifting and lack of reciprocity as reliable predictors rather than exceptions. They observe consistent behaviors where independence claims coexist with demands for traditional male roles when convenient, and victim narratives persist even when actions demonstrate agency in creating imbalances. This leads to probability based decisions, where the expected value of engagement drops below the threshold for investment, and solitude becomes the rational default that preserves autonomy and sanity. High value men in particular hold firm because they recognize their options include freedom or selective pairing without accumulated expectations that reduce appeal over time. Infrastructure and critical sectors already feel the effects as recruitment struggles in trades, military, and physical roles signal reduced willingness to accept conditions that once seemed standard. Boys in education systems face patterns where natural traits like energy or competitiveness get pathologized, leading to disengagement or confusion that carries into adulthood as double standards persist. Without balanced modeling of mutual respect, the cycle continues with each generation, observing outcomes and adjusting accordingly towards self protection rather than participation on unfavorable terms. These shifts compound over time, affecting everything from maintenance of physical systems to pace of technological or societal advancement that relied on broad male involvement. The convergence of these forces creates a moment where denial gives way to raw recalibration because scarcity does not sustain illusions of unlimited leverage or protection. Biology reasserts through differences in average strength capability and wiring that were never erased, only downplayed in favor of equality narratives that ignored trade offs. Economics demands accountability when debts mount and growth slows, exposing gaps between rhetoric and sustainable reality. Psychology favors those who build internal resilience over external validation because peace and solitude proves more reliable than cycles of conflict and repair that rarely balance the scales. Men who walked away did so after patterns left little room for optimism, and their continued choice signals that restoration requires genuine change rather than renewed expectations of compliance. Women confronting poverty, loneliness, and narrowed options in growing numbers experience the long term results of assumptions that independence carried no hidden costs or that male restraint was permanent weakness rather than deliberate choice for civilization. The can of worms opened through decades of pushing boundaries without regard for reciprocity now spills into practical hardships where state resources dwindle and enablers face their own limits. Lowering standards later reflects awareness of market adjustments, yet often comes after high value options have already settled into lives that no longer center on fixing imbalances they did not create. This is consequence, not cruelty, flowing directly from choices that devalued contributions while elevating demands without equivalent investment. The year ahead and beyond will test these realities more sharply as economic pressures force clearer priorities and men maintain the word no across domains, refusing unfair loads, one sided emotional expectations, or participation in setups that treat them as default villains or providers. This stance is not spite, but clarity earned through experience where compliance delivered, disrespect vulnerability, and eroded peace. Solitude delivers control over resources, time, and mental state in ways that entangled dynamics rarely matched, especially under accumulating resentment from berating false claims and demonization for basic existence. The peace found there is real and spreading because more men witness the alternative and choose the path that protects rather than exposes them. Broader societal adjustments will favor realism as ignored truths about capability, accountability, and balance reemerge when artificial supports weaken. Battles won on surface levels through legal or cultural shifts cannot override deeper dynamics when systems strain and individuals vote with their feet toward self preservation. Women who grasp this early can move toward mutual respect and shared effort, but the window narrows as disengagement solidifies into default for larger numbers. Hard times accelerate the sorting because survival rewards low dependency, inner strength, and clear boundaries over fragility built on fading privileges. This narrative continues unfolding through observable data and human responses without needing exaggeration because the patterns speak for themselves across nations and generations. Men found peace by walking away after years of treatment that treated them as disposable while demanding their labor protection and emotional labor without reciprocity. Women now face the practical edges of those same choices as economic realities strip padding and force confrontation with consequences that were long deflected. The sobering part is that human nature biology and basic economics never paused for slogans, they simply waited for conditions to reassert what sustains functional societies and relationships. Those who face the shift with open eyes will navigate the transition with fewer illusions and greater adaptability than those who cling to the old order as it frays. The biological realities that underpin everyday interactions between men and women have never disappeared, no matter how loudly certain narratives claimed otherwise. And those realities include clear average differences in physical strength, where men possess roughly 40% more upper body power, denser bones, and quicker reflexes shaped by evolutionary pressures that prepared them for protection provision and high risk tasks in harsh environments. For generations, men exercised deliberate restraint against using that advantage because they valued the social contract of civilized life, trusting that mutual respect and fair rules would keep interactions stable and productive. But that trust eroded as provocations became more frequent and consequences for male response grew disproportionately severe. A man might calmly walk away from a thrown object or a public slap in a restaurant to avoid the immediate risk of arrest under policies that default to treating him as the aggressor. Even when, evidence later shows the woman initiated the physical contact, and those moments of restraint deposit quiet resentment that builds over years until the only sustainable option becomes complete disengagement from the environments where such risks repeat. In one documented case, a woman repeatedly threw dishes during arguments until her partner simply left the home to prevent any escalation that could land him in legal trouble, knowing that physical restraint on his part would likely be ignored in favor of her claims, while another man discovered his girlfriend had posted humiliating ratings and stories about him online and chose silent departure rather than engaging in a cycle that offered no productive resolution. These are not rare anecdotes. They reflect a broader pattern where women initiated domestic violence at rates equal to or higher than men, according to multiple studies, yet media coverage and policy frameworks like certain arrest models focused overwhelmingly in one direction, creating a system that encouraged testing boundaries without equivalent accountability. Men learned quickly that even minimal physical response, such as grabbing a wrist to stop repeated hitting, could result in charges, while verbal or emotional aggression from the other side carried far less risk. And over time, this imbalance trained large numbers of men to view any close involvement as a high stakes gamble where respect was optional and self protection required distance. Cultural shifts amplified the problem because modern independence and legal protections gave some women overconfidence that historical survival instincts once moderated, leading to behaviors like following men into isolated areas or escalating arguments in public spaces, assuming that male restraint would hold indefinitely. In reality, restraint requires ongoing discipline, and when it is met with mockery, public humiliation, or threats of false accusations, the internal calculation changes for many men who redirect their energy toward personal stability rather than endless management of someone else's unchecked impulses. Infrastructure strains already appear in sectors that demand physical capability and risk tolerance as men quietly exit roles where contributions feel undervalued or exposed, leaving gaps in trades, military recruitment, and maintenance work that societies once took for granted because enough men were willing to endure for collective benefit. This withdrawal is not dramatic protest, but practical self preservation after patterns demonstrated that participation on current terms delivered disrespect, vulnerability, and eroded peace without corresponding rewards. Across the ocean in China, the marriage market has collapsed under unsustainable economic pressures where traditional expectations for men to provide houses, cars, and substantial bride prices have turned what should be a mutual partnership into a financial burden that ordinary workers cannot shoulder without decades of debt. Registrations plunged to just 6.1 million couples in recent years, marking a drop of over 20% in a single year and far below earlier peaks as men calculated the risks of asset division in high divorce scenarios, ongoing child rearing costs that can reach millions, and the likelihood of materialistic demands that prioritize status over genuine connection. Women in their mid 30s, many with advanced degrees or professional backgrounds, now express open regret over years spent delaying family formation while chasing career milestones or holding out for partners who met inflated standards, only to find the pool of willing men has shrunk dramatically, leaving them facing singlehood in a society where social norms still tie childbearing closely to marriage. One 35-year-old with a doctorate and prior career as a flight attendant described lowering her criteria to any man of basic character and stable income while vowing to pursue aggressive matchmaking because the label of leftover woman carried real social weight, and the fear of aging alone in a nursing home without family support hit hard after years of independence that left emotional voids unfilled. Another 36-year-old admitted being too selective in her 20s, rejecting suitable matches, only to realize later that the market had shifted and options narrowed, while a third simply gave up on dating, altogether citing the exhaustion of repeated emotional investment with low success rates. Successful men in their 30s with their own homes, cars, and decent incomes often refuse marriage outright, preferring the freedom to travel, save aggressively, and maintain control over their resources rather than risk losing half or more in a divorce that statistics show favors the other side in many outcomes. This creates a vicious cycle where matchmaking events overflow with female profiles while men opt for single life, viewing the whole institution as a losing gamble under current conditions. The economic backdrop only intensifies these dynamics because per capita disposable income remains modest around 30,000 yuan annually for many, while child rearing expenses, housing costs, and lifestyle demands have ballooned under consumer pressures that capitalism amplified without balancing responsibilities. Men who once might have accepted the traditional provider role now see the double standard, where women demand high earning partners, yet dismiss average men as insufficient, and they choose debt free solitude instead, watching their savings grow and their stress levels drop in lives free from constant negotiation or criticism. Birth rates have followed the marriage decline, dropping to around 1.0 or lower in some metrics, with projections of severe workforce shrinkage and aging population strains that policymakers scramble to address through blind dating events, mass weddings, and attempts to curb excessive bride prices. Yet the deeper attitudinal shift among men prove resistant to top-down fixes because personal experience with unfair burdens outweighs official encouragement. Back in the United States and other developed nations, similar patterns emerge, though expressed through different cultural lenses, where men in survival mode work multiple jobs or side hustles just to cover rent, food, and basic transportation, leaving zero bandwidth for the time, energy, and financial costs of traditional courting that often feels like a part time job with slim odds of success. Dating has become exhausting for many because each cycle requires starting from scratch, investing effort into someone who may ghost disappear after a few months or escalate into conflict over mismatched expectations. And when economic pressures already force long hours and constant budgeting, the additional load of emotional labor or financial gestures without reciprocity simply does not compute. Men turning 39 or older often reflect that they are content in single life, not out of bitterness, but because peace and self focus deliver more consistent satisfaction Then repeated attempts at relationships that demand they carry disproportionate loads while receiving testing criticism or entitlement in return. The survival mode reality hits hard for average guys who see friends juggling two full time equivalents just to stay afloat, and they recognize that adding a partner with high expectations would likely push them over the edge into burnout or financial instability without guaranteed mutual support. Women sometimes overlook this strain, assuming men should still perform traditional gestures or provide emotional availability on demand. But the math does not add up when wages stagnate against rising costs, and every extra dollar goes toward keeping a personal roof intact rather than funding dates or lifestyles that benefit someone else disproportionately. This leads to widespread opting out, where men maintain low expectations for romantic success and prioritize steady self improvement gym routines, skill building, and quiet routines that restore mental clarity eroded by years of navigating chaotic dynamics. Global poverty figures add another layer of sobering context because even as extreme poverty measured at very low thresholds shows some decline, broader measures reveal persistent or worsening hardship for hundreds of millions, especially women who face gaps in social protection, food security, and economic buffers that leave them more vulnerable during downturns. Projections indicate that without major course corrections, hundreds of millions of women and girls could remain in extreme poverty by the end of the decade, with climate and economic pressures potentially pushing millions more into hardship as gender disparities in employment quality and asset ownership limit resilience. In many regions, women are less likely to have access to pensions, unemployment benefits, or maternity protections acquired through work, and food insecurity gaps have widened, leaving them bearing heavier burdens when prices spike or jobs become scarce. These statistics are not abstract. They translate into daily struggles for rent, food, and stability that fuel the visible cries for help on social platforms where women describe inability to survive independently after years of narratives promising that self sufficiency would bring freedom without trade offs. The economic crash signals flashing across markets point to a final stage where record credit card balances, evaporating savings, and delinquencies on loans, mortgages, and autos echo patterns seen before major historical downturns. Yet official optimism persists, even as insiders sell assets at pace and yield curves invert warning of contraction. Commercial real estate values drop with office vacancies high, while small businesses close under combined pressures of energy compliance and labor costs, leaving fewer stable anchors for family or personal planning. Central banks face impossible balancing acts between inflation control and growth support, unable to print indefinitely without eroding currency trust. And when a triggering event hits the avalanche, can erase jobs, pensions, and stability faster than systems can respond. In that environment, men who already simplified their lives by walking away from high risk entanglements hold clearer advantages because they avoided tying resources to volatile partnerships or one sided expectations that amplify losses during scarcity. The social contract that relied on male collective restraint to maintain order now frays visibly as disrespect accumulates and protections weaken under fiscal strain. Men are not plotting confrontation, they are simply enforcing boundaries by removing themselves from setups that repeatedly demonstrated they would be treated as disposable villains or walking resources while their own needs for respect, peace, and fairness went unmet. This disengagement accelerates demographic and economic headwinds because fewer stable families form birth rates stay suppressed, and critical sectors lose willing participants, leaving societies to adjust to slower growth and greater individual reliance. Women who built assumptions around perpetual leverage or institutional shields now confront the practical limits when those shields thin. and the men who once absorbed the imbalances choose solitude instead. The raw truth here is that human nature, biology, and basic economics reassert themselves when denial can no longer be subsidized, and the patterns of the last decades produce predictable withdrawals that no amount of rhetoric can reverse without addressing root imbalances in accountability, reciprocity, and respect. Men found genuine peace by stepping back after enduring years of berating false claims, physical aggression, and cultural demonization for simply being men. And that peace proves addictive because it returns control over time, money, and mental health that chaotic interaction stole. Women facing rising poverty, loneliness, and narrowed options experienced the downstream results of choices that prioritized short term autonomy or leverage over building sustainable mutual bonds. And the hard economic times ahead will only sharpen those consequences as resources tighten and illusions of endless provision fade. This moment demands clear eyed acknowledgement that restraint was never weakness, but a disciplined choice for civilization. And when that choice loses its foundation, raw realities of capability and self interest take precedence. The coming period will sort individuals based on preparation, inner strength, and low dependency rather than past narratives. And those who adapted through simplicity and boundaries will navigate the transition with greater stability. The can of worms, opened by pushing without regard for balance, now spills into widespread rebalancing where men continue saying no to unfair terms and women must confront the gaps left by independence that solved some problems while creating others that no external system can fully fill when fiscal limits bind. Broader global trends show inequality and poverty measures evolving with consumption gaps persisting for billions. Even as extreme thresholds show movement, and women often bear disproportionate impacts due to employment quality disparities and limited asset control. In regions with rapid aging and low fertility, the strains on support systems intensify as fewer workers sustain more retirees, and migration shifts or policy changes cannot fully offset native declines rooted in personal choices against unstable partnerships. Men opting for passport options or complete singlehood reflect calculated risk avoidance where domestic markets feel stacked and freedom offers better odds of long term satisfaction than repeated cycles of high effort, low reward engagement. The psychological toll of constant boundary testing or emotional labor without appreciation wears men down over time, leading many to conclude that solitude delivers clearer benefits than relationships defined by shifting goalposts or entitlement. They build routines around fitness skill acquisition and financial discipline that compound positively without the interference of drama or legal vulnerability that once accompanied closer involvement. Younger men absorb these observations early, choosing paths of self reliance over repeating known pitfalls, and the cumulative effect reshapes labor markets, family formation, and social participation in ways that favor realism over enforced optimism. Economic outlooks for the period project modest growth at best, with risks of higher unemployment drifting upward as output slows and policy uncertainties weigh on confidence. Labor markets show low fire patterns with particular strain on younger workers and long term unemployed, while consumer sentiment reflects heightened fears of job loss or debt defaults amid sticky costs for basics. These conditions amplify the advantages of those who minimize obligations early and built personal buffers, turning what could be crisis into manageable adjustment for the prepared, while exposing fragility for those reliant on external supports or one sided dynamics. The sobering wake up call is that decades of social engineering created imbalances that could not hold indefinitely And the convergence with economic pressures now forces the reckoning. Men walked away, not in anger, but in clarity after patterns, left solitude as the rational choice, delivering peace that relationships under current conditions rarely matched. Women crying out for help or expressing regret in growing numbers confront the practical edges of assumptions that independence required no reciprocity or that male compliance would persist without respect. The year ahead and beyond will test these realities more intensely as scarcity strips padding and individuals rely more on their own capabilities and boundaries rather than fading institutional buffers. The physical differences that biology built into men and women create a natural hierarchy in strength and capability that no amount of modern conditioning has erased, and pretending otherwise sets up dangerous misunderstandings when tensions rise. Men carry that extra 40% upper body power, denser bones, and quicker reflexes, not as some social construct, but as the outcome of evolutionary demands that favored survival in environments where protection and provision required raw physical capacity. For thousands of years, women understood on a deep instinctive level that antagonizing someone with that advantage carried real risks, and they moderated their behavior accordingly because survival depended on cooperation rather than constant testing. Today, that instinctive caution has been replaced by legal shields and cultural stories that frame male strength as toxic while encouraging boundary pushing under the assumption that restraint will hold forever. This shift ignores the fact that restraint is a learned discipline, not an infinite resource, and when it gets met with repeated disrespect or physical provocation, the internal pressure builds in ways that eventually demand release, either through withdrawal or something far less controlled. Consider how quickly small escalations can reveal the fragility of the current setup. A woman in a coffee shop argument starts pushing and slapping her partner in public, and when he grabs her wrist just to stop the hits, bystanders immediately side with her, assuming he is the threat while she smirks, knowing the social script protects her position. That moment captures the imbalance where women can initiate aggression with lower risk, and men must calculate every response against potential legal fallout that treats them as default aggressors, even when evidence shows otherwise. Over years, these incidents accumulate, turning what should be minor disagreements into sources of deep fatigue, because no healthy relationship survives when one side feels constantly on trial for simply existing with natural traits. Men respond by documenting conversations, avoiding isolated settings, and ultimately limiting their involvement because the cost of good faith engagement keeps rising while the rewards keep falling. In China, the economic pressures have turned the entire marriage market into a high stakes transaction that ordinary men can no longer afford to enter. Bride prices have climbed to national averages around 69,000 yuan, with wealthier provinces like Zhejiang exceeding 183,000 and rural areas in places like Jiangxi pushing past 380,000, excluding the additional demands for houses, cars, and luxury signals that turn partnership into millions in total commitment. Per capita disposable income sits near 30,000 yuan annually, making these expectations a death sentence that can last decades, and men are walking away in droves, leaving matchmaking parks and agencies dominated by women over 35 who now express open regret over years spent chasing independence or high standards that left them labeled leftover and facing narrowed options. One 35-year-old with a doctorate who worked as a flight attendant and professor describes mobilizing every resource for aggressive matchmaking after realizing the toxic advice about total autonomy left her fearing a future alone in a nursing home without family support. She has dropped demands for height, looks, or material items, settling for basic character and stable income because the clock on vitality and fertility has become impossible to ignore. Another 36-year-old admits she was too picky in her 20s, rejecting suitable matches only to confront the reality that age and market shifts have placed her in a weaker position where even lowered standards meet resistance from men who prefer freedom over the risk of materialism complaints or asset loss in divorce. A third simply avoids blind dates altogether, citing the emotional drain of repeated investment with low success rates and the fear of wasting more time on cycles that end in ghosting or conflict. These testimonials reveal the gap between the promised freedom of independence and the practical loneliness that hits when economic downturns, demographic imbalances, and changing attitudes leave fewer willing partners. Successful men with their own homes, cars, and decent incomes often reject marriage outright, preferring to travel, save aggressively, and retire without the pressure of constant negotiation or threats over income levels that turn relationships into ongoing audits rather than sources of peace. The broader global poverty data adds a harsh layer of reality because around 10% of women worldwide have lived in extreme poverty since 2020, with projections showing 351 million women and girls still trapped there by 2030 if trends continue unchanged. In sub Saharan Africa, the rates climb dramatically, with women facing disproportionate gaps in food security, unpaid care burdens, and asset ownership that limit their ability to build buffers against shocks. Even in higher income settings, the combination of stagnant wages for average workers and rising costs for housing, food, and energy leaves many in survival mode, where every dollar goes toward basics, leaving nothing for the kind of stability that once supported family formation. Men in that environment juggle multiple jobs or side hustles just to keep a roof and food on the table, and they recognize that adding the time, energy, and financial load of traditional courting feels like taking on a part time job with slim odds of long term success, especially when relationships often last only 1 to 3 years before requiring the exhausting process of starting over again. At 39, one man reflects on approaching his birthday without recent dating efforts and feeling genuinely content in solitude, despite friends joking that something must be wrong with him for enjoying peace. He clarifies that this is not rooted in hatred or bitterness, but in clear calculation. After years of seeing the effort required for modern dating outweigh the returns when economic pressures already consume most available bandwidth. That's dating demands constant reintroduction. First dates novel experiences and emotional investment that quickly fizzle when long term compatibility does not align, and men enter each cycle with low expectations as a form of self protection because the juice simply is not worth the squeeze under current conditions. Women sometimes criticize men for lack of effort but fail to acknowledge that many are working 70-hour weeks across full time roles, part time gigs, and side hustles just to cover rent, gas, and groceries, leaving zero margin for the kind of sustained pursuit that once defined courtship. This survival mode reality is not abstract. It is the daily calculation for millions of average guys who watch friends burn out trying to maintain lifestyles that include dating expenses on top of basic survival. And they choose to redirect that finite energy towards self improvement gym routines, skill building, and financial discipline that compound without the interference of drama or mismatched expectations. The exhaustion of repeated starting over becomes too much when each short relationship ends in ghosting, conflict, or realization that the partnership brought more chaos than companionship, and men over 40 often report genuine peace in building wealth post divorce or simply maintaining independence without plans to re enter the market because the risks of asset division, ongoing obligations, and emotional drain outweigh any promised benefits. Lowering expectations to basics like mutual respect, shared peace, and genuine friendship rather than high drama or material demands can help in theory. But many conclude that even those simplified versions carry too much uncertainty when economic pressures and cultural shifts have made trust harder to establish. The economic crash that has entered its final stage compounds all of these personal calculations because the illusion of strength in record stock markets and corporate profits hides the real economy where credit card balances sit at historic highs, savings have evaporated, and delinquencies on auto loans, credit cards, and mortgages rise in patterns that echo the lead up to 2008, but on a larger scale with added layers of commercial real estate collapse and central bank constraints. Yield curves have inverted across the board, a signal that has preceded every major recession for more than 50 years. And insiders sell assets at paces rarely seen, while public narratives still push stories of soft landings despite small businesses closing under combined pressures of energy compliance, labor costs, and consumer exhaustion. Debt functions like a drug that initially boosts activity but eventually stops working when interest burdens crowd out other spending and governments cannot raise rates to 1980s levels without triggering immediate collapse under the weight of their own borrowing. When trust in currency and institutions fades, the avalanche moves fast with jobs, pensions, and stability disappearing faster than systems can respond, leaving those who tied their futures to volatile partnerships or one sided expectations exposed, while men who simplified through solitude hold clear advantages in resource control and mental resilience. In China, the marriage registrations dropped to 6.1 million in 2024, a steep decline from prior years, and even modest rebounds in 2025 reflect procedural changes or timing rather than reversal of the deeper attitudinal shift where men view the institution as a losing gamble under high risk, low return conditions. Capital has turned dating and marriage into a carnival of consumerism with demands for luxury gifts, honeymoons, and status symbols that inflate costs beyond what modest incomes can sustain. And this commodification erodes the warmth and companionship that should define partnerships, leaving both sides with regret, but men opting for single life as the safer path to freedom and travel without the pressure of family debt or complaints that turn home into another workplace. The psychological manipulation that occurs when systems get weaponized adds another layer of erosion because threats of police involvement over raised voices or fabricated claims in disputes train men to document everything and limit exposure, creating an atmosphere where good faith feels naive rather than virtuous. This is rational self preservation after patterns where restraint gets exploited and respect feels optional while accountability remains one sided. And over time, it leads to widespread conclusions that solitude delivers clearer benefits than cycles of testing and repair that rarely balance the scales. Boys growing up in education systems where natural competitiveness or energy gets pathologized as problems rather than traits to channel productively carry that confusion into adulthood where double standards persist and the framing of masculinity as inherently toxic unless serving approved roles accelerates disengagement from traditional paths. The dangerous misunderstanding of male restraint as weakness rather than disciplined strength under control sets up conditions where provocation continues until the breaking point arrives. And when that happens, the consequences shift quickly because biology does not negotiate with slogans. Men commit the vast majority of homicides worldwide and dominate strength based competitions, not through socialization alone, but through innate variances in muscle mass, testosterone, and risk tolerance that create hierarchies requiring respect to maintain order. Ignoring this while encouraging overconfidence in self defense delusions or media portrayals where smaller individuals effortlessly overcome larger ones teaches lessons that young men internalize as restraint being unvalued, leading some toward complete withdrawal or distorted expressions that societies then criticize further in a cycle that deepens fractures. Restoring balance requires acknowledging that complementary strengths between men and women demand mutual boundaries and appreciation rather than supremacy or denial of differences. And those who grasp this early can move toward genuine connection while the window narrows as more men settle into lives where control over their own time, money, and mental health takes clear precedence. The peace discovered in walking away spreads because it returns agency stolen by endless management of chaotic expectations and societies built on that agency, historically delivered the safety and opportunities that some now take for granted without maintaining the conditions that sustain them. Hard economic times ahead will accelerate the sorting, separating those who prepared through simplicity and detachment from those who relied on fading protections. And the reckoning will favor realism over rhetoric because human nature, biology, and basic economics reassert themselves strongly when denial can no longer be financed. Global multidimensional poverty affects 1.1 billion people with common deprivations in clean cooking, fuel, housing, sanitation, nutrition, and electricity, and climate hazards overlap with 887 million of the poor facing at least one major risk like heat drought floods or air pollution that amplifies vulnerability for those without buffers. Women often bear heavier unpaid care loads that exclude them from full labor participation, crowding them into lower paid sectors. And this dynamic leaves them more exposed when prices spike or jobs become scarce. In regions where female extreme poverty hovers near 10% or higher, the combination of limited land ownership, finance access, and decent work opportunities creates persistent gaps that no single policy can close without addressing interdependencies and the need for mutual effort rather than one sided leverage. The final stage of the economic illusion feels like calm before impact because markets protect themselves with rising numbers that ignore bad news in the real economy where families suffocate under cost for basics while wages lag and small businesses fold. Corporate bankruptcies climb, commercial real estate in major cities loses massive value, and consumer delinquencies worsen in patterns that signal deeper fractures than previous cycles. When a trigger hits, whether bank failure, debt crisis, or sudden loss of confidence, the fallout will feel personal, touching everyone with jobs vanishing, pensions eroding, and currencies fluctuating in ways that rewrite daily life faster than anyone can adjust. Men who already detached from high risk entanglements and built personal reserves will navigate that transition with greater stability, while those entangled in setups that demand constant provision without reciprocity face harder adjustments. In China, the projected 300 million single people by 2025, roughly two and a half times the entire United States population, underscores the scale of withdrawal, where men prefer single life for travel savings and stress free retirement, rather than paying to suffer through materialistic demands or instability that turns marriage into bankruptcy risk. Women lowering standards desperately after years of selectivity confront the market reality that high value men hold firm boundaries and many choose freedom over repeating cycles that devalue their contributions. This vicious cycle deepens as demands rise and participation falls, leaving both sides with outcomes that no top down encouragement can fully reverse without genuine reciprocity. The latest figures from China show marriage registrations reaching 6.76 million in 2025, marking an 11% increase from the prior year, yet that modest rebound still sits far below historical peaks and does nothing to reverse the deeper trend of men calculating the massive financial and legal risks before walking away from the institution entirely. Even with policy tweaks allowing couples to register outside their hometowns, and some cities seeing surges of 30 to 40%, the overall numbers remain roughly half of what they were a decade earlier, while divorces continue at high levels and birth intentions stay weak. Demographers warn that this uptick offers little more than a temporary glimmer because the underlying economic burdens of bride prices, housing demands, and ongoing expectations have trained too many men to view marriage as a debt trap rather than a partnership, and successful ones with stable incomes continue choosing travel savings and stress free independence over the threat of asset division or materialistic complaints that turn daily life into constant negotiation. Women in their late 30s and early 40s who once embraced the independent script now face the practical outcome of delayed family formation in a market where high value men hold firm boundaries and many have already built lives that no longer revolve around providing on unfair terms. The fertility rate continues its decline, with births projected to remain low into 2026, despite the slight marriage bump, because the cost of raising children in a competitive economy where wages lag behind housing and education expenses makes the decision feel like a luxury few can sustainably afford without mutual commitment that feels increasingly rare. This pattern echoes across developed nations, where the United States fertility rate hovers around 1.6 to 1.8 births per woman, with median age at first marriage climbing to 30.8 for men and 28.4 for women, meaning many enter the market later with established habits and expectations that clash with the realities of long term compatibility under economic pressure. Fewer than half of United States households are now married couple homes, down from nearly two-thirds 50 years ago, and that shift reflects more than personal choice. It signals a broad retreat from setups that once anchored stability but now carry disproportionate downside for men who have watched friends lose assets, time, and peace in divorces that statistics show favor the other side in many outcomes. Boys raised in systems that pathologize natural energy and competitiveness enter adulthood carrying confusion about their role when cultural stories frame masculinity itself as problematic unless it serves specific approved functions, and that confusion accelerates the cycle of disengagement as they observe older men thriving in simplified routines without the drama of constant testing or criticism. The result is slower workforce participation in traditional male dominated fields, infrastructure strains in trades and military recruitment shortfalls, and innovation paces that adjust to fewer risk takers willing to endure for collective benefit when personal peace offers a clear return on effort. Extreme poverty among women and girls stands at 9.2% in 2025, with 351 million still projected to remain trapped there by 2030 if current trends hold, and the gaps in land ownership, finance access, and decent work opportunities leave them more exposed when prices for food, energy, and housing spike during downturns. Unpaid care work crowds millions out of full labor market participation, directing those who do work into lower paid people centric sectors. And this dynamic compounds with economic scarcity, where savings have evaporated for average families and credit card balances sit at records that force constant juggling just to cover basics. Men in survival mode working multiple roles to keep a personal roof intact recognize that adding the time, energy, and financial load of traditional dating or marriage on top of those pressures rarely delivers reciprocal support, and they redirect finite resources toward gym routines, skill building, and financial discipline that compound positively without the interference of mismatched expectations or legal vulnerabilities. The national debt in the United States now equals roughly 100% of gross domestic product, with projections pushing it to 120% by 2036, and interest payments already consuming nearly one-fifth of federal revenue, meaning the government has far less capacity to respond to the next shock than it did in previous crises when debt levels were 35% or 80% entering downturns. Annual deficits hover near 6% of gross domestic product, and when the next recession hits, whether triggered by commercial real estate losses, consumer exhaustion, or sudden loss of confidence in currency, the ability to marshal massive stimulus will be constrained, leaving individuals and families to rely more heavily on personal buffers and low dependency lifestyles. Men who already simplified through solitude hold clearer advantages here because they avoided tying resources to volatile partnerships or one sided expectations that amplify losses during scarcity, while those who built lives assuming continued provision or institutional shields face harder reckonings when those supports thin. This final stage of the economic illusion feels eerily calm on the surface, with some market highs persisting even as small businesses close under combined pressures of energy costs, compliance burdens, and labor shortages in critical sectors. Yield curves and insider selling patterns have signaled contraction risks for years, and when trust erodes further, the avalanche will move fast, with jobs, pensions, and daily stability rewriting themselves faster than systems can adapt. In that environment, the peace that men discovered by walking away after years of berating false claims, physical aggression, and cultural demonization for simply existing proves its value because it returns control over time, money, and mental health that chaotic dynamics consistently stole. Solitude is not loneliness for them. It is clarity and self directed purpose, where effort produces direct results without the constant demand to absorb disrespect or fix problems they did not create. Women facing persistent poverty, loneliness, and narrowed options in their later years experience the downstream consequences of assumptions that independence required no trade offs, or that male restraint would persist indefinitely without mutual appreciation and respect. The independence sold as ultimate freedom solved certain immediate barriers, yet left practical and emotional gaps that careers, social media, or friend circles rarely fill completely, especially when health shocks, financial pressures, or quiet weekends reveal the absence of reliable partnership that human psychology never stopped requiring. Lowering standards after years of selectivity often comes too late because the men who once might have met higher criteria have already settled into lives of freedom, travel, and savings, where they maintain firm boundaries against repeating cycles that devalued their contributions or treated them as default providers without equivalent investment from the other side. The black pill clarity that spreads among men stems from consistent pattern recognition across cultures where entitlement, blame shifting, and lack of reciprocity reliably predict outcomes rather than isolated exceptions. And the rational response becomes boundary setting through disengagement or highly selective involvement that protects sanity and resources. This is not hatred or blanket rejection of women, but a clear eyed assessment after decades of data from personal lives, friends, and broader society showing that trust requires evidence of balance, not assumptions of perpetual compliance. Younger generations absorb these lessons early through shared observations, choosing self reliance education and practical skills or reduced hours that allow control rather than repeating known pitfalls, where good faith engagement yields diminishing returns in respect or stability. Global multidimensional poverty affects over 1 billion people, with common lacks in clean cooking, fuel, housing, sanitation, nutrition, and electricity, and climate hazards overlap with hundreds of millions facing heat, drought, floods, or pollution that amplify vulnerability for those without personal buffers or strong networks. Women often carry heavier unpaid care loads that limit full participation and asset building, leaving them more exposed during scarcity. And the sobering part is that closing these gaps requires mutual effort and realistic acknowledgement of interdependencies rather than narratives that frame one side as obstacles or default rescuers without reciprocal accountability. Investing in balanced opportunities could yield enormous economic gains, but only if paired with genuine reciprocity that values male contributions in strength provision and restraint rather than taking them for granted or mocking them as toxic. The dangerous misunderstanding of male restraint as permanent weakness rather than a disciplined gift to civilization sets up conditions where provocation continues until the foundation frays. And when that happens, raw realities of capability and self interest reassert themselves strongly because biology does not pause for slogans or legal shields that strain under fiscal limits. Men dominate high risk, high strength domains, not through socialization alone, but through innate variances in muscle mass, testosterone, and risk tolerance that create natural hierarchies, requiring respect to maintain order. And ignoring this while encouraging overconfidence and boundary pushing teaches lessons that accelerate withdrawal or distorted expressions that societies then criticize in self reinforcing cycles. Restoring functional interactions demands acknowledging complementary strengths where male self control is appreciated as the enabler of safety and progress rather than dismissed, and where women recognize that pushing without regard for balance carries long term consequences in any sustainable relationship or society. The convergence of economic meltdown, demographic declines, and accumulated resentment forces a broad rebalancing toward fundamentals where capability, accountability, and shared respect determine outcomes more than temporary protections or rhetorical claims. Men continue enforcing the word no across domains, refusing unfair emotional labor, disproportionate financial burdens, or participation in setups that treat them as disposable while demanding their full contribution. And this stance is clarity earned through experience where compliance delivered disrespect, vulnerability, and eroded peace. The peace found in solitude spreads because more men witness friends thriving in simplified lives with clear boundaries and lower stress levels compared to cycles of testing criticism and potential legal exposure that drained energy without building lasting value. Societies adjusting to these shifts will favor those who face truths directly rather than clinging to narratives that accelerated disengagement, and the hard times ahead will accelerate the sorting, separating the prepared with inner strength and low dependency from those reliant on fading illusions of endless leverage or institutional buffers. Women who grasp the need for mutual appreciation and balanced effort early can move toward genuine connection, but the window narrows as disengagement solidifies into default for larger numbers, and economic scarcity strips the padding that once allowed imbalances to persist. The can of worms, opened through decades of one sided pushing, now spills into widespread recalibration, where human nature biology and basic economics reassert what actually sustains functional relations and stable societies. This is the raw, unvarnished reality unfolding right now. Decades of treating men as defective or disposable while demanding their strength, protection, and labor without equivalent respect or reciprocity produced the predictable withdrawal that no amount of crying on social media or policy tweaks can fully reverse without addressing the core lack of balance. Men found genuine peace by stepping back, and they are not looking back because the alternative proved too costly in every measurable way, from mental health to financial security to simple daily freedom. Women sliding into poverty, loneliness, and regret confront the practical edges of choices that prioritize short term autonomy or leverage over building interdependent bonds that provide real buffers when systems strain and resources tighten. The year 2026 and the decade beyond will test these dynamics more intensely as debt burdens, interest payments, and potential contractions force sharper priorities and individuals rely more on personal capabilities and boundaries rather than external supports that have reached their limits. Those who adapted early through simplicity detachment and clear eyed pattern recognition will navigate the transition with greater resilience, while those who double down on outdated assumptions face harder adjustments. The sobering wake up call is straightforward human nature does not bend permanently to slogans. Biology and economics reassert themselves when denial runs out of funding, and the men who walked away did so after patterns left solitude as the only rational path to preserve peace and control. The broader story is one of necessary correction after a long period where imbalances were subsidized and ignored until scarcity exposed the gaps between rhetoric and sustainable reality. Complementary roles between men and women require mutual respect and boundaries to function. And when that respect erodes, the withdrawal follows as surely as night follows day. Societies built on the quiet discipline of male restraint delivered the safety opportunities and progress that some now take for granted without maintaining the conditions of appreciation and reciprocity that sustained it. And the rebalancing underway will favor realism over continued denial. To the 1 hour gang who made it all the way through, thank you for sticking with it. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show some support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. What did you think about what we discussed here? Do you agree with the patterns we laid out? Drop a comment below and share your honest thoughts. Like the video if you like. And do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to men walking away in cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.